Actually, the psychotic statements are less far-fetched than the therapist and that. And this is typical of many dialogues that take place. See, because the schizophrenic is typically, no matter how confused he is, searching for truth. And when he utters statements in however metaphorical or cryptic a form about spiritual truths in the universe, the psychiatrist, whose whole life is built around creating barriers to recognizing that there is a spirit, becomes frightened and calls out religious delusions. Anyway, Lang, I said that he could interact with the schizophrenic in such a way that they both emerge as stronger and wiser beings. He realized that frequently individuals in distress find it difficult to conform to the conventions of everyday discourse. And when I say conventions, you see, there's a different kind of convention that governs poetry or that governs art than governs everyday discourse. But why should it be so? Why should there be a different convention? Why should we feel constrained by the norms of everyday speech? The surrealists said poetry should be made by all, not by one. There were certain people, Shakespeare commented how the lunar and the lover and the poet all spoke a similar kind of language, all seemed seized by a similar kind of poetic inspiration. And you find that in Plato too. So let's suspend these kind of judgments of this is unrealistic, this cannot be spoken this way, as Lang did. Enter into a dialogue with someone.
So
okay, in many cases.
Are you saying now that a person in his madness, quote, is in a way searching for the same truth in the way a poet searches for a truth?
No, I'm saying
ultimate truth.
That may be true in some cases, but that wasn't what I was saying at the present. What I'm saying at the present, you'll be clear when I read the next thing, is that frequently people who are psychotic are talking in a poetic kind of discourse. They speak a poetic language.
They're using metaphor.
They use metaphors. Sometimes they won't talk at all. For example, in the last dialogue that I just quoted with the psychiatrist and the schizophrenic, at the end of the dialogue, after the schizophrenic, this was months having to listen to the psychiatrist tell him how he wanted to eat his penis and all kinds of crazy things that only this Freudian cult believes anyway. The schizophrenic said, tears come from my ears now. Now, R.D. Lang, who was a psychiatric heretic, as I'm a heretic, said, what a beautiful poetic way to express the fact that there's the sadness this man felt, that there's no communication between the people. That they're not hearing, that he's not being heard. Tears come from my ears now. So, at any rate, that particular communication was obviously not understood by the psychiatrist, but the schizophrenic was commenting on the abyss, the lack of communion between two people, and that communion doesn't take place because the psychiatrist says, this is crazy, this is mad, this is sick. I am the one to interpret it because I've been to school for so many years, because I've studied at the canons of the great master Freud, the great guru, or whomever, or because I've studied biology and I've determined that this person is genetically flawed. I don't have trouble here. And to continue. Thus Lang, when the person was in a state of distress, sometimes finds it very difficult to communicate in the way we're communicating now. Thus Lang discovered a variety of unconventional ways of being with them. On one occasion, for example, after touching fingertips for an hour with a child who had not spoken in over a year, the child suddenly spoke. He felt understood. He felt confirmed as a being. His idiosyncrasy, his deviation from what the world considers normal, was ignored by Lang. It was not considered significant data. It was not seized upon as an opportunity to say, I'm better than you. You need me. To go back to my text, it's not a question of choosing the right technique, but rather of a response that emerges spontaneously out of a willingness to recognize one's fundamental kinship with the other. No matter how different that person is, if one recognizes one's kinship as a fellow human being, there's a possibility of that kind of healing communion that profits, I shouldn't say profit, that enriches both people. I said, Lang welcomed the stranger, the mad person, the schizophrenic, and saw in him or her a reflection of his own self. That's why Lang didn't have trouble communion with schizophrenics, and why I don't have trouble. I can go into mental hospitals, and
Yes.
I've never been locked in one, and visiting people. I cannot commune with those psychiatrists. They scare me.
Well,
The terrible things they do to people,
the
and their
image-
total obliviousness to God and to the spiritual life whatsoever. And yet the schizophrenic, even when he's not making sense, I use the term with quotation marks.
Yeah, well, the image I'm getting here is that on the one hand, Lang is somehow grasping the possibility that we were all in the net together. We all make up the universal net, and we are in some way, all of us, connected to each other in a very, very way that's equal one to the other. It's almost
Very
like
good.
we are all born and we don't have any of the classifications, psychiatrist, lawyer. We are all sort of connected in a way that is, well, I can only say spiritual.
Exactly.
Is what my feeling. I wonder if you could get into a little bit of the politics behind, because I know that as you're talking about drugs and
How much more time do we have?
we
Is 15
we have
minutes?
enough. We have enough. Just go into the.
All right, let me get a pause, but let me just comment on
Yeah.
what you said there, just to amplify
okay,
it.
okay.
That's a good statement. It's that Lang did recognize the unity of all beings. And I would call it, you mentioned equality. I think we could call it spiritual equality or ontological equality. Let me
Okay.
define that a little, okay?
Please.
Because everybody knows that a child and an adult are not equal. The adult is smarter. I won't elaborate on the variety of ways. And yet, it's recognized that there's an equality. The whole language of psychiatry denies that spiritual equality. Well, the child is regarded as a spiritual equal. Once the label is put upon him, the person, schizophrenic, manic depressive, it's like a stigma. And it's a denial of the spiritual equality. The recognition of the spiritual equality Lang had.
Yes.
He saw that a person may be more confused than he was. He was in a stronger position. But then, like Christ said, it's all the more incumbent upon him to give aid to the stranger, to the alien, to the one who's less strong. And through that exchange, that person becomes strong and is eventually enabled to enter into, well, this is a political dimension, and able to enter into a political community of equals.
Well, what if you have a political community which is fired by the need to sell drugs because you are in business and you have a pharmaceutical company that has large warehouses that have to be supported, you have to pay real estate, and how does this fit into the...
Today in America, you have a vast psychiatric pharmaceutical complex. Now, that complex its very function is undermined if it's based on the spiritual equality of all people. For example, there was a moment in the 60s as a result of Thomas Szasz's work and Lang's work in which people started talking about, well, we can help schizophrenics rejoin the community if they're given support, blah, blah, blah. This started to happen. The psychiatrists became afraid because then you started having people say, well, after all, it's not a medical problem. And that meant all those years of training, the medical credentials, we're reducing the inequality between the people. We're opening up a situation in which we're moving toward a state of not only spiritual equality. Once you recognize the spiritual equality, I think Abraham Lincoln said something like this, what follows next is that every community has a responsibility to educate and strengthen people so that they can participate as equals in a political system, in a democracy. But psychiatry has to maintain the schizophrenics as pariahs on the bottom.